Welcome back to the Deep Day Podcast, episode 14. Before we get into it, I just want to say a huge thank you to everyone who has been listening and supporting us throughout the entire time. Really, really does mean a lot. And huge shout out to you guys. Absolutely appreciate it. Without further ado, let's get into it. So, I wanted to talk about something, and it's quite controversial, perhaps. If you're not good with suicide, maybe this isn't the right episode for you. We have plenty of others, and on Patreon as well, so do go check that out. But my therapist wants me to kill myself. My therapist wants me to kill myself. Maybe the world would be a better place off without you. These were the words I never expected to hear from my therapist. Up to that point, she had always been on my side, despite the many flaws that made up my character. I had fleeting thoughts of suicide, but it was never something I intended to act upon. Sharing them with Dr. Covenwood was usually a comfort, something that her soothing voice and wisdom could easily dispel. Reciprocation never even occurred to me. What? I asked in confusion. She reached into her desk and pulled out a pamphlet, of which she handed me one. People don't understand you, Phil. You're special. Let them live in their ignorance. There's a place for you that's better. It's time to move on. It was a brochure of sorts. Next World was a paradise of the afterlife, equipped with beautiful, otherworldly charm and happy community that even put heaven to shame. At least, that's what the pictures and descriptions made it seem like. I was baffled, but intrigued. What is this? I asked. This is your solution. A place you can live without fear or worry. She pulled out an envelope from the drawer and emptied it into my free hands. It contained a sharp silver utensil. Leave tonight, Phil. Use this to do it. The portal will be opened and you will travel into the next world. Trust me, it's for the best. Dr. Covenwood never looked so serious, but she didn't need to. Between my admittedly frustrated and fractured psyche and the intense trust we developed over the years, I had an unhealthy attachment to her. Whatever she told me to do, I did without question. She could have told me to jump off the nearest bridge to my death, and I would have, just to appease her. I was a broken man. Okay, if you say so. No further words were spoken. She simply gestured to me to leave and then turned around in her chair, facing the wall. I would be lying if I said our strange conversation hadn't shaken me, but I still agreed to her terms and left, once again putting my life in her hands. Rational thinking was a luxury I hadn't had in many years. That night, in the zombie-like stupor, I prepared. I sent the appropriate, vague goodbye messages to what family I had, and sent my pet cat, Barney, outside to roam free with the strays in the area. With that, I ventured to my bedroom, turned the lights off, laid down in bed, and got to it. I'll spare you the details of the act itself. Just know that it was far more pleasant. Whilst laying there in a pool of warm liquid, waiting for my eternal slumber, I noticed something. My vision was beginning to blur, but I could see a figure at the foot of the bed. It was a man, cloaked in darkness, a shadowy statue, painted in the room by an unseen brush. A single ray of moonlight outlined his form, allowing me a glimpse at some of his features. He had grey hair and looked to be around 50 years of age, covering his body, a suit you might see in the closet of an esteemed professor. Across his face, a wicked grin that stretched from ear to ear. Though on the verge of death, I was still frightened, jarred by his presence. The pounding in my chest was the only movement I could muster in my wounded state. I was forced to watch in agony as the man turned his head upward and opened his lips as wide as humanly possible. From his eyes and mouth, a white light was expelled into the ceiling. The blast broke through the roof and more than likely cut a hole in the night sky. The house around us shook, and all at once our environment was transformed. I was no longer laying in bed. I was now in a white room, healed of my self-inflicted scars. I pulled myself to my feet. I surveyed my surroundings. Before me was a white table, behind it 2 doors on either side. Standing opposite me was the man, his head still tilted. The light had now dissipated. After a moment or two, he lowered his gaze and met mine and smiled. "Sorry to scare you. It was necessary for the transition. Please, take a seat." The man motioned for me to sit at the table. I obliged, but remained cautious. He sat down from across me. "We are here to determine eligibility. Normally, when a mortal is killed with a next world artifact, they move on without issue. However, when it is done deliberately to oneself, a judgment is needed to complete the process. Make sense?" I was amazed. Dr. Covenwood was speaking the truth. The next world was real, and I was ready to take my place inside, hopefully for a better existence. I nodded. "Good. We can begin." The man handed me a blank sheet of paper and a fountain pen. "Answer truthfully. The paper will know if you're lying." To my astonishment, questions appeared on the page. I would write out my response, the ink would vanish, and the next query would present itself. Some were normal, asking for mundane personal information, while others probed for answers about my actions in deeply strange scenarios, such as, if given the choice, would you rather have your skin removed or your soul? It felt like an exam I could never have studied enough for. When all was said and done, I handed the paper over. The man put on a pair of old-fashioned spectacles and looked over it, as if what I wrote was still there. Oh dear, this is not good. Not good at all. I looked at him perplexed. "What's wrong? You were referred by one Elizabeth Covenwood?" "Yes," I said. "Is there an issue?" "Well, Dr. Covenwood has recently been brought to our attention for violating one of our sacred rules. She's what we call a collector." I was confused. "Collector?" "Yes, she sent many a patient to the next world, in hopes of easing their pain. Collectors are usually malevolent by nature, killing the innocent with our artifacts and feeding off the energy expelled from the act. She's different. Her intentions are morally sound, but her actions will conflict with our code of conduct. She's even gone so far as to pass around non-sanctioned, printed material revealing privileged information about this place, as I'm sure you've seen." "What does this mean exactly?" I asked. The man bore a heavy look of disappointment. "Unfortunately, given the circumstances of your departure from Earth, you're considered non-eligible for residency in the next world. You will now be escorted to the other world instead." "Other world? Where's that? Will I be okay?" The man offered no reply or consolidation. Within a matter of seconds, I was lifted from my seat by an unseen force and pinned to the surface of the table. The man stood up from his chair and pulled a strange-looking dagger out from his jacket. I tried to break free, but it was no use. The sharp point gently caressed my skin, forming an X on my torso, just below the heart. In a flash, I was lifted off again, and then pushed into the door at the right-hand side of the room. It was swiftly shut behind me. I turned back, but the door was gone. Around me, an endless black void. I ran, desperate to find even a sliver of light in the darkness. This endeavour was unfruitful. No direction offered any dissonance. The only thing that broke up the landscape was the occasional shadow in the corner of my eye, slightly darker than the canvas behind it. I would glance over it in an attempt to catch it in my field of view, but it was too fast. Before I knew it, I was pinned in place again, sprawled out on the floor beneath me. Shadowy figures loomed overhead. With them came voices, 3 distinct whispers in the dark. It's different than the rest. You say that from every shift. They're all different. Shall we learn from it? I'll prepare the fragmenter once the examination is complete. Why do you even bother with that? They can't die here. It's just torture. Don't forget your training. Anguish is the energy that powers the next world. It's the payment we make in exchange for studying these creatures. I suppose it makes sense. Who would like to make the first decision? May I oversee? It would be my first. If you slip, its fall will fragment too hard. We'll have to wait 1,000 years for it to reconstruct. I can't even begin to fathom what type of being would have experienced in that time. I'm aware of the risk. I believe I am ready. Very well. You may begin. One of the shadows reached for me. I screamed as loud as my lungs would permit. The fear had fully set in. I no longer wished to be dead. This was not what I signed up for when I pushed the silver metal into my flesh. I was blindly fulfilling Dr. Covenwood's wishes. Still, I secretly hoped the afterlife would offer me some solace. A peaceful existence, free from the thoughts and memories that plagued me back on Earth. This was something far more sinister, a truth I never wanted to know. Before the shadows could make contact, I fell asleep, into a deep, dreamless sleep. Faint voices filled the room. He's lost too much blood. I was in and out of consciousness for a while. Should we get the paddles? My vision was fuzzy. There were many forms around me, but I could not make out anything discernible. He's back! We have to keep going! I could not hold on any longer. I had no choice but to succumb to the weariness and drift off. I came into a brightly lit room. It was spinning, but everything eventually stopped, revealing its design. It was a hospital room. I looked down and saw bandages all over me, covering the marks I had made with the tool Dr. Covenwood gifted me. It seemed I was somehow alive. Was this all a nightmare? A nurse came in to greet me. Good, you're up. You unlucky man. We nearly lost you last night. It's a good thing we have some of the best doctors in the world in this hospital. I offered a half smile. This is going to sound strange, but could you please tell me? I am alive, aren't I? This isn't the afterlife. She chuckled. No, of course not. You survived your injuries, but just barely. I guess that means you're stuck here with us for a while longer. She smiled, but then bore a look of concern. It's not my place to bring this up, and you don't have to talk about this if you don't want to, but I have to ask. Your wounds look sporadic and uncontrolled. This is common with these types of cases. So... She hesitated. Yes? I asked. She let out a sigh before resuming her query. I really shouldn't pry, but why did you carve an X into your chest? When you go to heaven, they take your skin. The car accident was a blur. A symphony of shrapnel flying across the highway, the debris of at least 3 vehicles. At the time, I didn't know who was at fault, or what exactly happened. I just knew pain. Immense, searing pain all over. I was in and out of consciousness for a while I can put together a picture of the following hours, however murky. The moments I do remember will forever be etched into my memory. I first came on a gurney in the hospital, rushing through a brightly lit hallway. There was some chatter about my condition, but none of it was promising. A simple but ominous sentiment from a nurse stuck out like a sore thumb and stayed with me until I was sprawled out in the operating room. This doesn't look good. Shaking on the table, I recall more bright lights as well as the beeping of medical machinery on either side of me. Many doctors and nurses were at my side, scrambling to keep me alive, though my mind was an utter mess. I do remember thinking that this was the end of my story. Between the intense injuries and the panicked doctors, I knew death was right around the corner, waiting for me. My life didn't flash before me. I didn't think of my loved ones left behind. There wasn't enough time for that. I simply succumbed to the endless slumber and closed my eyes as the flat line rang across the room. My eyes were fogged, but I could make out the shape of a tunnel ahead. At its end, a light. I made my way to it, cautious, but, I admit, curious. Eventually, I reached the glow and my vision returned. I was in a bright room. Before me, a tall, older gentleman in a white robe stared down at me, standing on a podium. He beckoned for me to come closer and spoke with enthusiasm. "Hello, newcomer. Welcome to heaven." He gestured towards the wall behind him. There was no pearly white gates, just a minimalistic red door, void of any knobs or handles. "Heaven? So I'm dead." The man smiled. "Yes, indeed you are, but fret not, for this is heaven, a paradise of the afterlife. Would you like to enter?" Honestly, I was disappointed that my life was over, but I knew it was inevitable, given the circumstances. At the very least, heaven was seemingly real, and had been accepted. Yes, I would like to enter. I stepped forward, but the man placed his hand on my chest, stopping me. "Before you can enter the world above, an offering is required." I was confused. An offering? Of what sort? The man smiled again. "We need your skin." My face contorted in dismay. "My skin? But why?" "I can't provide specifics. Just know that will be too cumbersome for you on your journey. Don't worry, the removal is a mostly harmless procedure." "Mostly?" The man unsheathed a thin, silver utensil from his robe and gathered my forearm. He began carving, to which I pulled away. "I'm not removing your skin. That's well above my pay grade. I'm just marking you for our records. I have to dig deep enough to engrave your muscle tissue. Please don't move." I reluctantly allowed him to continue. The pain was severe, but it was nothing compared to the injuries I had sustained in the accident. When it was over, I looked down to see a string of unrecognizable characters, along with the numbers that made up my birth date, 03/04/1991. The man then pushed the red door open and stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. I asked one more question before progressing. "Are you an angel?" The man pondered for a moment before replying. "I prefer celestial overseer, but if that term suits you, then yes, I am an angel." He mentioned again for me to enter. Though not completely satisfied with his answer, I obliged. The door was swiftly shut behind me, leaving me to survey the area. It was a room, similar to the previous one, only void of anything other than myself. I was confused as I walked to its center. Was heaven a plain white room? Was something supposed to happen? Just as I was about to go back to the red door, the unthinkable happened. I was inexplicably launched upward at great speed. If I had to guess, my velocity was akin to that of a meteor hurling through deep space before meeting Earth's skies. In a matter of moments, I began to burn up. A blue flame filled my field of vision, before turning orange, then red. As my speed increased, so did the pain. It was like I was in hospital again, dying of irrevocable damage. What was happening? Was I reliving the pain of my death? The ascent continued, and with it, a deadly realization. I wasn't just burning up. With great difficulty, I was able to tilt my head and gaze upon myself. My skin was peeling. I watched in horror as I left my body completely, slipping into the great white abyss below. All that was left was my muscle tissue. Soon after, the flame subsided and my motion slowed. Steam surrounded me as I landed in my new location. Though experiencing an insurmountable burning sensation, I was still conscious and aware, alive if you could even call it that. It was hard to focus on anything but the sharp sting enveloping me, but I was able to comprehend my whereabouts. It was an endless white void within, a plethora of bodies scattered about, skinless humanoid forms writhing in pain, covered only in red connective tissue, much like my own. They left blood trails as they crawled, slid across the white floor. My knees quickly gave out, and I lay down in agony, unable to fight the anguish any longer. I desperately crawled to the nearest individual and spoke with the little energy I had left. "What is this? Is this supposed to be heaven? Why did they take our skin?" The grotesque red face of a person looked at me and cried, "They wear it." A shiver danced across the length of my spine. "What? Who? Who wears it?" Before I could receive a response, an electric shock filled my body and jolted me awake. I was once again in the hospital on the operating table, somehow living, albeit barely. I tried to stay afloat, but I wound up drifting away into the abyss of painless sleep. I woke in bed, bandaged up from head to toe. My injuries still stung, but not quite as much as they did before. A nurse assured me I was okay, and very lucky to be alive. Recalling my experience and unable to see most of my body, I had to ask her, "My skin? Do I still have my skin?" She chuckled. "Of course you do. Some of it will be scarred, but rest assured, it's there." I sighed in relief, knowing my trip to heaven was just a strange medical and shock-induced nightmare. Thank goodness. It wasn't until a few weeks later, when I was finally able to go home, that I would discover something terrible about my wounds. I have told some about my near-death experience, but never the following, for fear of what conclusion might be drawn about my sanity. My first day back was peaceful. I relaxed and enjoyed my quaint life, happy it wasn't ripped away from me in an untimely manner. The next couple of hours, however, were anything but quaint. During my second night home, I woke up in a fit of sleep paralysis, my bedroom soaked in darkness and warmer than usual. There, standing at the foot of my bed, dimly lit by a sliver of moonlight coming through the window, was the tall man from heaven. His plain, stoic expression was broken up only by the occasional grin, a malevolent smile that made my skin crawl beneath the blankets. The spike in adrenaline was not enough to break me free of my chemical restraints. I was forced to endure his presence and watch in terror as he walked to my side and spoke. It wasn't always this way, you know. He was now close enough for me to feel an intense heat that his body was giving off. Heaven truly was a remarkable place. A world where mortals spent their afterlife in peace. The man grabbed my wrist. It burned, but I was unable to react. 1,000 years of routine breeds of fierce boredom. We were bored up there, never knowing what it was like anywhere where humans roamed. A need grew within us, a craving to explore the outside world of our realm. He picked off a piece of melting flesh and waved it under his nose like a glass of wine, inhaling the aroma. Our forms don't bode well in Earth's air. Your skin is the only thing that tempers the reaction, otherwise we'd break down and disintegrate. He spread the piece of flesh onto his arm, creating a thin layer of protective paste. The heat dissipated. "You've been marked. We need you back." We locked eyes. He tilted his head slowly in observation as I futilely attempted to scream. His face lowered to meet mine. Tremors erupted through my body. Still, I could not move. Then, suddenly, he vanished in a puff of smoke, leaving me alone in the darkness. Once the man disappeared, I was able to move again. I felt my wrist and it was fine. No missing skin. However disturbing this incident was, I knew it had to be a remnant of my dream from the hospital, a side effect of the trauma I suffered, nothing more than a recurring, albeit terrifying nightmare. Regardless of this explanation, I was unable to sleep until daybreak. The next night was as strange still. After brushing my teeth and looking up at the bathroom mirror, I saw something that shook me to my core. It was me, but without skin, a horrific, amalgamation of red, muscly tendons made up my facial structure. Behind me, the tall man, his voice echoing off the bathroom walls. "Come back to us." I fell back into the wall. The man was not there. When I looked at the mirror again, the sight was a normal one. I chalked this up to being another troubled facet of my psyche, post-car crash. It was clear at this point that I was severely troubled. I started entertaining the idea of seeking professional help in the form of a psychologist. The next night, however, disproved of all previous theories about my bizarre state of affairs. Upon peeling back the bandages on my arm to bathe for the first time, I saw it. There were the scars in odd, unrecognizable shapes, as well as a familiar numeric sequence. 03/04/1991.
Thank you for listening to the Deep Day podcast. You can find us on Instagram, Spotify, iTunes and YouTube. Enjoy the podcast, and more can be found at www.deepdaycast.com. Thanks again, and have a great week.